We are apparently recording this this meeting, so please take note of that. Okay. Yeah, shall we get going?
Yeah,
Show on the
let's do
road?
it.
Okay, all right. So thank you very much for coming, everyone. It's great to see you online, and we're super excited to have a speaker here. Let me just get us started with a few words. Let me introduce myself first. I'm Sandra Schillo, and I'm the lead of the Inclusive Innovation Research Cluster at the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. And we're hosting this event here today, which is the Food for Thought event of the ISSP. Super excited to do that, and we're doing that in collaboration with the Inclusive Innovation Hub. We are excited to have our speaker Viet Vu here with us today, and we will introduce him in a moment. But before we do so, I would like to open this event with the University of Ottawa's land acknowledgement in the spirit of reconciliation and inclusiveness, and to open this this meeting with a good mindset. So I'd like to pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I'm excited to see that we have about 15 attendees, participants online, and we do have folks here in the room as well, so really appreciate that. Now, by the way, I know, excuse me, I know some of you are familiar with the ISSP. I see some names that are unfamiliar, so let me just briefly introduce the ISSP. We are a cross-faculty institute at the University of Ottawa, and we explore the links between science, society, and policy. Our strategic vision is to help Canada transform decision-making to meet the grand challenges of our time. And we do pursue this vision by strengthening relationships between academia, business, government, Indigenous organizations, and civil society. And we've got 4 research clusters. We have a very active energy research cluster with the flagship project Positive Energy, which is led by Monica Gattinger, who's also the director of the ISSP. And we have our fabulous Inclusive Innovation Research Cluster hosting Viet Vu here today, and I lead that. And then we also have clusters on robotics and artificial intelligence and science advice. And those are led by Jason Miller and Mark Sana. Now, inclusive innovation is, of course, an extremely important topic at this time. In addition to the speaker series, we have a bunch of activities going on, so feel free to check us out. We have shared projects going on where we have collaborations with partners in the agri-food space with the National Indigenous Women Entrepreneurs Ecosystem, and we're also having a couple other initiatives. One is a very new initiative where we have launched what's called the Inclusive Innovation Hub, i2hub.ca, if you want to check us out there. And the other one is this fabulous speaker series, which we're co-hosting today with the Food for Thought series. And I'm really excited about this speaker series because inclusive innovation really is a very complex topic. And innovation in general is, in today's world, is so intertwined with so many different aspects. So today we're going to be hearing about artificial intelligence and the labor market, and it really takes a deep level of expertise to kind of wrap our heads around how that all hangs together. So I'm super excited about our speaker today, and I'm excited to introduce Louise Earle, Senior Fellow at the ISSP, who will introduce Viet.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's super exciting actually to have Viet Vu here. Viet is he leads the economics research at the Dais at Toronto Metropolitan University. I can remember that. He he, prior to the merger with the Toronto Economic, sorry, I'm going to get that wrong. Prior to the merger at the Brookfield Institute, Viet also did some, extensive work on the impact of technology in the labor market. In Canada, the technology sector, workers, digital skills, and scale-ups. His research has been widely cited in national media and has impacted policies at all levels of government. And Viet has recently returned from the UN Internet Governance Forum that was held in Kyoto, Japan. This is a multi-stakeholder forum was on internet governance issues such as online safety and regulating AI, cybersecurity, as well as Canada's approach to regulating online harm. So he's well versed in the topics. And he is also going to be talking to a number of government executives at Forum 50, where he is leading a workshop to help the federal government improve the digital culture. So that is coming up this week. And we are piggybacking on to having Viet come to Ottawa to talk to government executives, to talk to us today about artificial intelligence, the labor market, and inclusion. So, Viet.
No, thank you, Louise. And before you think I'm impressive or anything, I was trying to book my flight for Christmas actually to Calgary yesterday. And then I sent my family the bookings, and then I get, you know that you booked it for November 16th to 30th, right? Instead of December 16th and 30th. Thank God for Canada 24-hour cancellation. So I didn't have to pay for that silly booking. But legitimately a massive, massive pleasure to be here today. I didn't realize that Ottawa already has frost, and so that I pretended not to see that as I was coming in this morning. But we're gonna pretend that it's still the summer. And I think the screen is already shut, which is wonderful. Yeah, AI. No one knows what that is. We're going to talk a little bit more. But before we start to go into the topic, I do want to say a little bit about who we are as Dais. Particularly, we are actually just under a year old. It was a really cool sort of merger between two organizations at TMU. Some of you may know that as Ryerson. We changed that name about a year and a half ago. The Brookfield Institute and the Leadership Lab. And so the Brookfield Institute, as sort of Louise mentioned, is where I come from, where we have for the past 6 years or so engaged in a lot of research that particularly is focused on the digital economy, how technology is impacting people in the economy. And then we also have the Leadership Lab at TMU, which was focusing on doing a lot of work, particularly in developing leaders and preparing them for sort of taking leadership in conversations on sort of democratic stability and conversation on responsible adoption of technology. And so back in sort of April of this year, we merged officially with the group to form the Dais. And so we still do a lot of good research. We also do a lot of events these days. We're actually jokingly calling it the traveling roadshow because one of my colleagues actually up in Montreal right now doing another talk, while someone else is, I think, actually up in Banff. We used to not do as much of those, and so very, very excited to have been invited. And so thank you, Louise, Sandra, and the entire sort of U Ottawa team that has welcomed me here. The way that I think today is going to work, which I think is this slide, is that what I'm going to talk about will draw on a whole bunch of work we have engaged in the past, some of which I was directly authoring, a couple of which were sort of researchers within a research group that has done work on. And there are also a couple of other work from sort of other scholars in the area and people who have also done this for years and years that I'll be referencing. But one of the things that we actually very much pride in is the effort that we put in actually illustrating the work and making sure that the work that we do not only is sort of technically rigorous, but also look pretty. And so I wanted to give a shout out to a lot of our amazing illustrators who have illustrated many of the works, and it's sort of a sample on some of the work that we'll be putting together here. Right, the way that today's going to go is that we are going to hopefully do 3 things. The first thing that we're going to do is sort of agree on what AI is, and in particular, the type of AI that we're talking about. Because you realize that AI will mean a lot of things, and so we're just going to agree on some definitional frame on what we're talking about and what we're particularly not talking about. And after we have agreed on that, we're going to look at the impact of AI in the labor market in sort of two different frames. The first, on the group of people who is involved in creating the technology, and then the second, which are the group of people who are exposed to sort of using the technology and directly sort of impacted by it. And through those sort of two frames, hopefully there is a wider conversation on the technology with a particular inclusive lens, which I know is a particularly important part now in conversations on regulating AI and the trajectory of where this technology is going. So let's get started. This is probably the most as precise a definition I can get, and I'm going to explain what that implies and why it's actually not the definition that we're going to be using today. So AI at its core is a statistical tool that has an objective function that it's trying to maximize, aka either loss function, a cost function of some sort, based on a whole bunch of inputs. And the way that the parameters on this function is sort of optimized is by a data set that exists that connects these inputs to an output. And so from this definition, a regression is an AI. You have your data, you have your betas that you're trying to estimate, and the way that it's trying to optimize it is using, as you know, a least square algorithm in optimizing the actual parameter values. And so it actually covers a whole wide range of things. And you realize really quickly, therefore, that not all AI is actually consequential, particularly in conversations on the labor market or the wider economy. And so what we're actually going to use today is a bit more of a functional definition of the technology. We're not talking about regressions. We're not talking even about, whenever you are trying to see technically if you're coming up with a correlation matrix, that's a very rudimentary form of AI. What we're talking about today is, number one, it kind of is a consumer-facing technology. That is to not mean sort of a general public consumer sense, but it is a particular form of AI that a lot more people is going to use. That can have sort of a user interface attached to it, or it can just exist within a technical frame. But the second part is a particularly important bit, which is that the technology has to be either making decisions that sort of impacts a person's experience and interactions with the wider world, whether that be through the online sense or not, or is actually making recommendations, sort of it's outputting things that is informing and influencing the decision that people are making, which then ends up influencing sort of people's experience with the world. And so what that means, right, is that, for example, in terms of automatic decisions, the most classic example is if you go on YouTube right now, and if you have an account on YouTube, there will be a curated list of videos that Google or YouTube as a company wants you to see. Those decisions were made by a statistical program, an AI program, that then actually impacts the kind of videos that you're exposed to. So that's sort of number one. It's already making those automatic decisions for you. On the second, on the recommendation sense, imagine if you are an insurance adjudicator. A lot of large insurance companies have sort of deployed these kinds of models where you input a whole bunch of customer data into the system, and then they sort of recommend you the rate at which you should be charging these customers. And while there are ways to be overriding these decisions, that sort of rate that this sort of AI system is recommending you charge for an insurance sort of a policy is still going to likely influence your decision in the actual sort of plan that you offer your customer. And so those are the kind of AI that we're sort of going to be focused on today. Not necessarily just all of us running 18 different regressions as researchers to pick whichever one that gives us the best P value. Don't actually repeat that. That is not what you're supposed to do. That is called P hacking. It's very, very bad. But we're actually going to be talking about these sort of restrictive sense of what an AI technology is. And oftentimes, I think conversations on the impact of AI inclusivity focus a lot on the costs. And we will focus on some of these costs and some of the things that we have to be thoughtful about using such as technology and adopting it and leveraging it. But I do want to start off by just stating outright, right, is that AI is a technology, and technology actually has really good use cases. Otherwise, we don't develop them. Oftentimes, some of the best ways in which we have grown our economy, the way in which we have improved our living standard, is by relying on technology. And so just quickly wanted to go through that there are some fairly uncontroversial and good usage of AI that actually delivers not only economic good, but social good. One example here is that a lot of AI applications has now been deployed in financial institutions to automatically flag suspicious transactions, particularly when the conversations on data leaks, your credit card number leaking online, and identity fraud is increasing. Instead of you having to call the bank every time you go to the country, most of the banks actually have systems to flag whether a set of transaction that is appearing is suspicious or not. That then allows you to more seamlessly able to stop any fraud-related transactions from taking place. That seems to me at least a fairly good use of AI that actually is efficiency improving. That saves a whole bunch of people's time through phone calls. That also saves people money from these suspicious transactions and frauds. The second implementation of AI that I'm going to use an example here that is incontroversially good is in the realm of what is called protein folding. And so protein folding is a particular problem that exists in the realm of biology, where these complex structures that forms proteins that need to satisfy a particular set of metrics in order for it to be a viable protein. And the reason why people care about that is because that by folding a protein in a very specific way, you actually end up with different pharmaceutical compounds that creates new drugs, new treatment regimes for the kind of diseases and illnesses we currently don't have treatment for. And up until a number of years ago, the way that they did this, which was actually quite ingenious, is to turn it into a game, a video game where they released it out in the wild. I actually played it as a high schooler about a decade ago, where you can literally play around with a 3D model to try to fold the protein to meet this metric. And then they will collate this massively crowdsourced a set of data on all the different protein folding to reach an actual viable protein that they can make new drugs with. Now, we don't have to do that. New AI technologies have actually been used to come up with ways to fold proteins to then suggest new drug compounds, new pharmaceutical interventions that is way more effective without needing a teenager sitting in their computer playing a video game to figure out. That seems to be a good thing. But then there are also bad things with the technology as well. And I'm only going to cover one today, particularly because the conversation on today's conversation isn't necessarily on squarely focused on the social benefit versus social cost of AI. There are many scholars, such as Tina Gebru, Alex Mitchell down in the States. There are also many in Canada who work on it. I'm much more of an expert in labor market, and so I'm not going to butcher their research on it. But I'm only going to mention one thing to start us off as a framing of the conversation. Just about 2 weeks ago, I was giving a talk on AI in the economy to the Insurance Brokers Association of Ontario. And so, as an overused party trick, I named the talk "Elephant in the Room" because everyone seems to be wanting to talk about it, even though there's a scat fear around it. And so I used a very popular generative technology, DALL-E, which allows you to input text prompts, and then it will output an image that corresponds with it. And so the text prompt that I used is "elephant in the room full of insurance brokers," because it turns out that is not necessarily a standard imagery that you can find on Google. That's the image that fits out. You might notice by this point that every single insurance brokers they put in the room are men. I can assure you that the room of insurance brokers I talked to did not look like that room. There were a significant number of women in the room, and yet that wasn't represented here. And that's one example through which while innocuous, imagine if you are sort of a woman trying to determine your career path, trying to pick a major in university, and you actually really love sort of the insurance industry, because what I also found out was that insurance brokers actually are very much embedded in the community that they serve, particularly small insurance brokers. They tend to form relationships in sort of at the family, even at the religious community level. And so it is actually kind of an attractive career path for you to go into if you want like a community-centric thing. And then you go search online, oh, what do insurance brokers look like? If you're faced with these kind of images, that may actually discourage you from going into that profession. But when we start asking the question of how to address this, that's actually a really, really difficult question. And that's simply because inclusion, particularly in the realm of technology, but more broadly, is not a technical problem. It's a social one. And to illustrate this, I want to propose a number of ways in which we could have fixed that. Now, you realize each of these kind of gets the idea of how do we introduce diversity to the kind of output that AI is generating. The first way is that every single photo that the AI technology is generating have a minimum representation requirement. Let's say every single photo needs to include a woman, a person who is visibly Black, a person who is visibly trans. That's one way of solving it. The second path that we could be using to be solving it is that, particularly if you're generating a group photo, you can create, this is theoretical realm, technically slightly more complicated, but each face has a probability of forming a particular identity. And so if you go back to this sort of previous photo, imagine that this person has a 30% chance of being a woman. That person has a 50% chance of being an Asian descent, and each face has a particular percentage, and it randomizes across each face, and therefore creating a whole bunch of mixes of representation. That's a second path. A third path is that a group photo has this very specific probability of only including people and faces that belongs to a particular identity. In the sense that if you ask it to generate 10 photos, it could be that there will be a photo of all just sort of white men here, or it could be that you generate a photo where there's only women in it, or only Black women in it, or only visibly sort of Asian descent persons in it. Each of these is a different answer to the question of how you introduce the idea of inclusion into technology. And it's not clear what is the best way, isn't it? It's not exactly clear how you can then generalize it into a technical solution to be introducing the idea of inclusion, because, quite frankly, it is, as I stress again, not a technical question. It is a social one. Given that, it probably matters then to actually start understanding, to start figuring out who is involved in making these technologies, because these aren't the kind of questions that, oftentimes people say, ooh, as long as the data is more representative, we'll solve this. But I hope that I demonstrated to you, there are actual choices that you need to make as people designing and creating these technologies on how you actually interpret the idea of inclusivity, what you prioritize, the kind of choices that you need to make. And so it kind of does matter who is involved in making a technology. There are, I think, some early research evidence that shows that a more diverse group ends up making more diverse technology. That's not necessarily always a given, but having sort of people of different identities probably and controversially increase the chance that these kinds of conversations actually take place, so that thoughtful discussions can take place at the point that the technology is being designed. With that, we are going to move to that second set. In understanding the labor market of those who are involved in making technology. And the way that we're going to use so is by using, so to give a bit of a background, what I did was that I used census data, particularly going from 2001 to 2016, actually just got approved so to use the 2021 long-form microdata in the data center back in Ottawa. Oh no, not in back in Toronto. Thankfully, I don't have to go to Tony's pasture anymore. And so some of the 2021 results will be updated sometime soon. We ran some preliminary analysis with the 2021 public tables, and the result doesn't seem to change a lot, which I'll sort of discuss in a moment. But what I wanted to figure out was, what is the probability that a person with a particular combination of identity is likely to be in a tech occupation? And tech occupation here defined as sort of jobs and occupations that is a high level of exposure to sort of digital context. Whether it could be that you're required to know a lot of coding, whether it could be that you interact a lot with computers at your job. And so this is sort of a relative measure. We're taking the top sort of 5% across all occupation in Canada and calling it tech here. And the next graph I'm going to show you is going to compare the probability of someone being the tech occupation when you change that person's identity from this base identity. And I'll explain in a bit of what that means, but the base identity, I titled John as a John Doe. There isn't necessarily any thought that was put into it. John is a white and married non-immigrant male in his 30s with at least a bachelor's degree living in Ontario. And so what I mean by that is, John probably has a very particular probability of being in a tech occupation compared to working in a non-tech occupation. But what if we change John's ethnicity so that he's no longer a white and married non-immigrant male in his 30s, but let's say is an Asian and married non-immigrant male in his 30s? How does that impact John's probability of working in a tech occupation? And so for those who are in the room who might know this, these are basically just sort of logic regression odds ratio that I then converted to essentially conditional probability measures and plotted them out. And so at the top on that dark blue line, you see John's probability of being in a tech occupation from about 2001 to 2016. It hovers around 20%. And so someone with John's identity has a 20% chance of working in a tech occupation. That also means that he has an 80% chance in not working in a tech occupation. The first thing that I did was I changed John's sex. So I know that in the 2021 census, there are different measures now between sex and gender, but this is data up to 2016, and so I'm using sex, particularly the female sex, to proxy for John being a woman here. But imagine if John, instead of being a male, is a female. That probability drops. We don't change anything else, right? Still in 30s, still unmarried, still a non-immigrant, still living in Ontario. Just by changing John's sex or gender, that probability drops to about 7%. What if we then take away John's bachelor's degree? What if John has done a college degree or just graduated from high school without having done a full bachelor's degree? That probably drops further to now about 1 to 2%. And the final thing that I do just to illustrate how different identities intersect and compound and impact this probability, I also now add the fact that John is an Indigenous woman without a BA. And her probability of being in a tech occupation now drops to below 1%. That idea of inclusivity goes beyond participation as well. When you look at how different sets of identities impact pay in a tech occupation, these are sort of hourly pay. And so what that means is that we understand that some people, particularly women, let's say, are more likely to engage in work, particularly in a part-time engagement or part-year engagement, because the childcare duty that currently still traditionally more likely to fall on women. We try to take away all of that and just compare for the same single hour that you work, how much money are you getting, to get down to the idea of pay inequity that goes beyond sort of work arrangement, which is an important set of consideration, but wanted to figure out for the exact same amount of work, how much are you getting paid? and how does your identity impact that? And sex, which is sort of that second line from the top there, hovers around $3 to 2.5 to $3. I do know that in 2016, that number was not significant. All the other years are significant. We're still trying to figure out why the significance goes away. Could be related data, which is why we're excited to sort of test that with the 2021 data in a bit. Having a bachelor's degree absolutely helps. And the bachelor premium over the year has actually grown from under $7 to about $9 an hour. And that, to me, particularly seemed interesting because it was supposed to be that, hey, tech doesn't care about your bachelor's degree anymore. As long as you have a portfolio, you'll be able to work in it. But in fact, having a formal education still allow you to get paid a whole lot more. Visual minority, fairly stable, unfortunately, and negative. The most interesting thing within this is how sort of one's immigrant identity impacts your pay. Because back in 2001, there was basically no difference in pay between an immigrant tech worker and a non-immigrant tech worker. But as the year sort of went on, it started, a negative pay gap started developing, where by 2016, an immigrant tech worker were getting paid about $4 less than a non-immigrant tech worker in Canada. And there are a couple of hypotheses here. The 2001 year is a particularly significant year. That is when the current sort of form and high-skilled immigration in Canada, what we now know as express entry, was established. And my hypothesis, therefore, was that there was already likely pay discrimination there, but given the slightly more restrictive immigration regime that Canada had, the kind of immigrant that the only kind of immigrant that managed to get in with a truly exceptional one. But even then, that truly exceptional group was just comparable in pay to the domestic tech workers. And as we sort of admitted, still really high skilled, would like to consider myself one of them. I became citizen in like 2022, came to Canada in 2011 to UBC. I realize I'm fairly dumb, but I'm hopefully not that dumb. Just to actually feel like I deserve a $4 pay gap to domestic tech workers. That meant that even though the group of immigrants are still working in tech exceptional, that started just exposing that pay gap a little bit more because there is just a higher group of people to compare to with a bit more of a wide-ranging set of skill set. And so that to me was particularly interesting. I hope I've convinced you, therefore, that the composition of tech workers, the people who are involved in creating technology matters. And I've also hoped that I've now convinced you that in Canada, there are kind of issues related to that. Now, there is one good thing about tech work in Canada, though. This is work that we actually just published about 2 weeks ago. One of our senior economists, Vivian Lee, led this project, where we were also curious to see how our pay in tech compared to pay in tech in the US. Top line number that doesn't really matter within this context is that US tech workers get paid about $40,000 more. And so if you're a Canadian tech worker, you're making about $80,000. The moment you move to the States, you're making 120,000 Canadian dollars. We control it all for like things like cost of living, interest rate, exchange rate, all of those. But an interesting thing started emerging, which is that we then tried to decompose where this pay gap was coming from. Because one can imagine, right, given the previous graph on the pay gap, that if we know that women in tech get paid less, if we know, for example, immigrant in tech gets paid less, and if it turns out that the Canadian tech sector just employs a whole lot more immigrant tech workers, some of that pay gap can be explained by the composition of your workforce, as opposed to the actual sort of pay gap that exists, that is just not explained by your composition. What we found out was that even if we're to equalize pay in Canada across all tech workers, that only explained about 10%, but that's a fascinating part. It only explained 10% of the gap, because what we realized was pay for tech workers in the US was a whole lot more unequal across racial lines, across education lines. And so even though in a couple of that previous graph I've shown you that there are issues in the Canadian tech sort of pay and participation, it actually turned out that in terms of pay equity, we are actually better than the States. We are paying people a lot more consistent amount, even though there are still pay gap that exists. And so in this particular graph, you've got sort of pay in Canada for tech workers, median wages across each of these sort of visible minority groups. And you can still see that gap. I don't know whether I actually included the US. Oh yeah, here's what it looks like for the US. As you can see, the lowest is 72 in Canada, the highest is 91 in Canada. The lowest in the US is 92 to $170,000. The gap is just a whole lot wider. And so that does show what our perhaps strength is. It does show we're still not 100% there, but hopefully an encouraging sign and the kind of things that we can leverage as we sort of involve ourselves in this conversation on these technologies. There's another interesting thing. So, right, I forgot that I put that there, which is great. So we're going to talk about this anyways. Another really interesting thing that we looked into is, particularly when you looked at the graphs previously, on the fact that you need a bachelor's degree. Having a bachelor's degree in tech means that you get paid a whole lot more. You're also more likely to participate in it. But does it need to be a bachelor's degree in a technical field, or can it actually be any bachelor's degree that gets you this? And so there's work that we just published last week. Graham Dobbs, one of the senior economists, other senior economists sort of worked on this, where we looked at LinkedIn profile data and focused on two particular occupations, data science and software development. Actually, Ibrahim, who just entered the room, he also worked on it. I'm pretty sure he was the one who made this graph. A wonderful PhD student in Ottawa in economics. We actually noticed the fact that, and particularly what we're interested in was, can micro-credentials, a non-full degree sort of boot camp workshop classes in data science or software engineering allow you to participate in tech work? And it actually turns out that yes, if you actually look at the fact that people without micro-credentials sort of being in I think this is for data science, am I right? I can't see because of the chat screen on reading the graph titles, but has only about 9% chance of having taken in a non-STEM degree. But for those who have taken a micro-credential in data science, who are now working as a data scientist, that's about 15% of the people. And so you're much more likely to be able to transition into tech work, having a non-technical BA by taking a micro-credential. And so that's a fascinating thing. It seems that that line of, hey, your degree doesn't matter, seems to hold as long as you have a degree, just any degree. If you don't have a degree, that's an entirely different situation. Having said that, then, I see that's the slide that I added with the one word. The question that I have before we move on to the next section is this the group of people we trust with making decisions about how the idea of inclusivity show up in tech? We already have a couple of examples on the kind of technology that gets designed, even in medical interventions. Let's say the kind of cameras that now help detect whether you have skin cancer or not. We know that that works on a particular type of skin luminosity and less so on darker skins. The workforce composition, the kind of people that are directly involved in making this technology matters. That's the first thing that I want you to think about. Having sort of talked now about the group of the labor market sort of thoughts that relate to the group of people that create technology, we're now going to actually talk about how the technology that is then created ends up impacting workplaces and peoples. We're going to start with a disclaimer. This deserves repeating because that is the top question on many people's mind. Will I have a job in the next 5 years? it's very unlikely to destroy all jobs or even many jobs. That is just the fact. The simple anecdote I usually like to tell, the first time that people wondered this question was actually in the 1700s. David Ricardo wrote a book, sort of a primer book, one of the first books that defined modern economics principles book. Literally in, I think, chapter 23 or so, had a chapter called On Mechanization. And he wondered the exact same questions that we're all wondering now. Turned out fine. In the 60s, when electric street lamps were starting to be introduced and installed in New York City, the lamp lighters also started wondering, is this going to be it for work? That, hey, with electricity, what are we going to do? It turned out fine. In the 90s, sort of factories started to get automated when sort of serious sort of technologies that were introduced at manufacturing plants, same conversation started taking place. In 2016, most recently, just about 6 years ago, before we had this conversation on the chat GPT and whether generative technology is going to put us all out of jobs, had the exact same conversation. 6 years later, we still have jobs. And so it's unlikely to destroy all jobs or most jobs. That does not mean, however, that the conversation isn't important, right? Because in the 90s, those workers in those manufacturing plants that were automated, they were impacted. The lamp lighters in New York, they were impacted. The question, though, is how we sort of talk about the actual risk and how we then talk about how to support those workers that might be impacted by this technology. The second reason, though, that we probably shouldn't be scared, and this will go into a little bit more, is that it's just simply the case that not a lot of companies in Canada are currently using AI. This is from work by one of our senior policy analysts, Angus Lockhart, that was published about 2 months ago, where we used StatScan data, particularly the survey of digital technology and internet use. That survey, from an administrative sense, I think the response rate was really high, something like 90%, a random sampling from the Business Register that asked any businesses that employed at least 5 employees whether they used a certain technology. This particular graph shows you the extent to which these businesses use AI. That sort of is defined fairly broadly, anything from machine learning, automated decision making, the kind of technology we talked about earlier. In 2021, only about 4% of any businesses with 5 employees or more in Canada have adopted the technology. And so we shouldn't be scared, but we're probably very interested in figuring out how these 4% of companies are deploying the technology, and whether or how they need to consider deploying the technology. And most importantly, we know that there's about 96% of companies that hasn't adopted it, which probably goes to the roof if you use a scale. What are the kind of things they need to consider when they're adopting this technology? And how do we think about the impact on work? And the theoretical model, a lot of people have developed, and I'm namely thinking about David Otter, Daryl Nachimoglu, and this became the zeitgeist around the 2016 is what is called a task-based model of work. And what that means is that we decompose work into a set of discrete tasks. For example, responding to emails, that is the task. Technically, sort of typing on a keyboard, that is a task. And so all of our jobs can be decomposed into hundreds, thousands of tasks. Now, that task can, through sort of a couple of mathematical and economic tricks, which is kind of like literal alchemy. We like to pretend that it's sort of math and it's all science, but a lot of alchemy is involved. We can then collapse all of those tasks into a single line that goes from the least skilled to the most skilled. Obviously that works, there's no issues with that. We're going to ignore any issues with that for now. But from that point on, you have the sort of low skilled tasks, you have the middle skilled tasks, and you got the high skilled tasks. And our understanding of automation technology at that time was that the technology that exists were really good at automating those middle tasks that are routine in nature. And so what a routine task is a kind of task where you can write a detailed instruction, a step-by-step sort of instruction on how to accomplish that task. And any sort of reasonable person can look at that and perform the work to roughly the same quality. And so building IKEA furniture, we'd like to believe anyways, even though it turns out that with the step-by-step instruction, we still end up with different results on the IKEA furniture, but something like that would be a fairly routine thing. Typing data into an Excel sheet, that would be another thing that is fairly routine. You can sort of have a step-by-step instruction on how to do that. Those kinds of jobs, the theory goes, exist in the middle. And the theory was useful because it actually predicted kind of what the data showed, which was that as machines replace those the tasks that are middle skilled, those people who used to work in those middle skilled portion were either pushed to have to compete with the high skilled people or to compete for jobs at the low skilled spectrum. And that ended up having an effect of what's called a job polarization, where you end up with sort of wage effects that increase the share of people working the low end of the wage spectrum. You also increase the set of people who are working the high end of the spectrum with sort of middling out. That was what we saw up to about the mid-2000s. And then we actually, interestingly, saw that didn't actually apply anymore from the 2000s onwards. We actually didn't see any more polarization. It ended up being that the top or percentile in income rose a whole lot more. The middle and the bottom was actually quite stable. But this theory was useful because it explained data up until a certain point, the wave of technological growth that sort of took place. The question then is, will that model sort of hold up in understanding the current trends of technology and how that impacts sort of jobs and work? And it's a really good question. I haven't seen a satisfactory answer as to the actual efficacy of the model. The model is actually quite robust, right? It does make affordances to new tasks being created. The model is also robust too, because you don't just have to replace the middle bit. You can also replace that sort of high-end bit or the low-end bit. And so the model is actually quite robust to introducing all these kinds of different ways to be modeling automation. But one thing that it doesn't particularly do well, at least yet, because it is a model that is very much based on replacing a task and what that means for workers who are occupying that task space, is how sort of technology can complement workers, which is the bit that I want to talk about with particularly sort of generative technology. And so there is a graph that was taken from a very recent paper by Eric Brynjolfsson in Stanford. And this uses ChatGPT in a call center context. And so this was kind of an experiment that was ran, where you introduce sort of ChatGPT to aid call center sort of responses to allow you to form responses based on the text prompt sort of suggestions. And the key question was, how did that end up impacting productivity? How did that impacting work? Is there a chance of sort of workers like that being replaced? Because one might have imagined, I think Sandra was actually showing me this example earlier, ChatGPT isn't quite there in actually being able to write things very effectively for you, but the technologies potentially, hypothetically, could actually help you write better and save time in sort of the initial composition. And so this paper was testing that hypothesis. The particular measure, it's a long paper that has a lot of different metrics that I'm showing. The particular metric I'm showing here is it was measuring the performance difference between the most high-skilled worker and the lowest skilled worker, which was measured by tenure. If you just started a job or how on the length that you've been in the same job. And this is about when they introduce the technology, sort of where the blue dots turn to the red dots. Before they introduced technology, the text similarity of responses between the low-skilled workers and the high-skilled worker was about 0.55. The number, there's a particular example on why that number is that. It matters is that as the technology was introduced, the text that the low-skilled workers generated became a lot more similar to the text that the high-skilled worker was generating. And this example was particularly interesting to me in the conversation of inclusion, because one of the conversation you care about, and not necessarily a thing that I think a lot of people think about in terms of inclusion technology, is access to educational opportunities is not equal. Access to the kind of skills training that allows you to perform in a particular way at work is not equal. And so that then ends up propagating other kinds of inequalities in the labor market. And what seems to be the case with this technology is that it seems to help somewhat in closing that gap. And that's a good thing, I think, all around. And we're going to talk about some of the examples where it's not good. But again, wanted to start on the example where it is actually potentially good, is that it allows people, because another graph that is in this paper is that as people use the tool more and more, they also become better at using the tool. And so that actually saves company on training time, that actually increases efficiency, and particularly that potentially also ends up reducing the kind of pay inequity that is faced by workers doing the exact same job, but might not have been afforded the right opportunity for trainings to do that job in a particular way. And so the task replacement sort of model doesn't deal with this well, because it assumes that it is just replacing a task, as opposed to actually helping you do a task better. How you theoretically model that, we haven't, I think, come up in the profession on the best way to do so, but that is what I want to leave you with. Other ways, because AI is not just about, introducing as a work tool. There are other ways in which companies introduce AI in the workplace that impacts workers. That is less and controversially good. Workplace surveillance being one, where I think the archetype of this is Amazon, where not only in the warehouses have they patented this sort of bracelet that gives a worker a literal electric sort of like shock, a very minor one, when they don't see them moving fast enough. They've actually patented that technology. It's a famous case of sort of delivery truck drivers having a camera installed in front of their truck to ensure that they're actually delivering on time, to ensure that they're paying attention. There are workplace surveillance technology that is aided by AI that changes work conditions and work sort of environments quite drastically. That's not necessarily a good thing. Performance measures. Again, Amazon that tracks 18 different metrics. I'm making up a number here, but probably way more than 18 on how quickly an associate at a warehouse is putting these orders in the boxes, how many that they're sort of sending off the right time, and that impacting a performance valuation. Oftentimes there might not be even a human involved, or it might be recommending specific job actions to a human manager that then informs the decisions that they might be making. HR pay negotiations, even the fact that lots of sort of AI tools are now being used very silly, in my opinion, to judge whether a job candidate is sort of happy responding to interview positions, which, excuse my language here, is bullshit, according to many of the scholars who do work in this area, particularly because sort of sentiment analysis on facial expression is kind of a pseudoscience. But those systems are being deployed by businesses, particularly large ones, in the name of efficiency, in the name of actually improving efficiencies in things like hiring, pay determination, and others. And so all of these, right, goes beyond productivity, which is oftentimes the primary concern as economists that we have about introducing technology. How does that impact productivity? Because that then sort of talks about the idea of justice, which economists aren't necessarily often well-versed to discuss, because as the profession, we kind of takes as a given that there is a justice framework that society gives to us. We're just trying to maximize that. This is where I think have to rely a lot on actually working with colleagues who work a whole lot more in these areas that are outside of econ, in supplementing our understanding of how technology ends up impacting work. And so if you've got any thoughts, ideas, absolutely, I welcome this. Beyond jobs, how will it actually impact experiences for consumers? Because again, these technologies isn't just being introduced at the workplaces. The technology that is introduced at companies will undoubtedly actually end up impacting how you as a customer interact with the business. Shopify has recently, I think, introduced this chat GPT based concierge service for business owners or clients of Shopify to do data analytics for it. We'll see how that ends up resulting in the actual customer experience. There are less sort of banal examples here as well. There was, I think, a case in the US where a hotline that existed to support patients and sufferers of eating disorders fired all of their human sort of responders and introduced a GPT-based technologies to support patients and people who are suffering from eating disorder. They had to pull the plug when it came out that the GPT-based product actually ended up affirming and sort of perpetuating the insecurities they feel about their body. There are real costs and real implications of this technology, not just the workers, but consumers and people at large. And how do we then cost this sort of badly implemented technology is the second key question that we want to answer here. And so I want to sort of stop here and leave enough time for sort of discussions, questions, thoughts that you might have. But before I do that, just a really quick summary. AI covers a lot of things, as I think we explained at the beginning. It covers anything from regressions to that kind of GPT technology. Only some of it actually matters in much of the public discourse. And I do think it does a disservice in the conversation without acknowledging that fact. There are lots of uses of AI that are good, that are incontroversially good, but there are very specific implementation of AI that probably deserves a whole lot more conversation about without us being distracted by these other uses of AI that doesn't actually have these kinds of big implications. And in talking about these things, I want us all not just to think about the end user and the end workers that gets impacted by these technologies. I also want us to focus a lot more on the kind of workers that create these technologies. Technology isn't created in a vacuum. People are involved, humans are involved in making human decisions that informs the design of a technology that then creates those impacts that we see. And so how do these technologies get created? How can we improve the process through which considerations on inclusivity, consideration on harm gets included in this process? And the key part, right, is that none of this should be construed as we should not be adopting this technology. We should absolutely be adopting this technology. It is great. It does a whole bunch of things that we used to not be able to do really, really well. We just need to be thinking thoughtfully about it. And by that, I mean, don't start with the technology. Start with what you want to achieve as a business, as an organization, the kind of values that you have, and then go to how the technology will help you achieve that objective. Oftentimes, if you start just from that frame, you're most likely able to figure out how the technology help you achieve that objective and how, in particular, the technology might not get you all the way there. You should, as I think I see some companies do and some organizations do, just start with the technology. Oh, this is really cool. How can we then introduce it to our company so that it does the cool things? That seems to be, at least to me, the way to lead to the kind of technology implementation that ends up with a lot of sort of problems. And so I'll leave that there. And I don't think I have oh, thank you so much sort of slide here, but thank you for sort of listening.
Thank you, Viet, very much for a very thoughtful discussion. I really appreciated the fact that you brought in the fact the technology is a technology and it's a social question, not just a technological question. So we would like to start a discussion. Please do put your points into the chat. If you have questions, please do write them up into the chat. And I do have a couple of comments before the talk. Viet and I were having a chance to have a little bit of a talk. One of the things that we were talking about were Indigenous peoples and AI and how all of that could work. So I was wondering if you wanted to pick up on that conversation. And we also had some other conversations about the solo paradox and how some firms are responsibly introducing AI. So I was wondering if you wanted just to start on that, and then we can move into what the people online have to say.
Yeah,
Around
absolutely.
the room, please just wave at me, so we can get the conversation going.
No, and so I was chatting with Louise a little bit before this event started, right? Is that I think it's quite a big disservice. Because I think when we often talk about Indigenous peoples and economic empowerment, a lot of conversations start with the fact that, they don't have access to clean water. And so how can they, does it even make sense to include Indigenous peoples in these conversations on sort of digital technology when these basic needs aren't even met? Oftentimes, I think there are also dangerous misconceptions about Indigenous economies that is sort of often, there's this I think orientalized is the word I'm going to use, but similar that for Indigenous peoples, the traditional industries, hunting, those kinds of things, that the economy is stuck in 100, 200 years ago. But that cannot be further from the truth, right? In fact, a lot of conversations on how we think about responsible usage of data started with conversations on how we treat Indigenous people's data responsibly. One of the most important set of principles that I think actually help guide a lot of these conversations is what's called OCAP principles, ownership, control, access, and participation, that allows Indigenous people's ownership of the data, that any data collected about Indigenous peoples must first be owned by Indigenous peoples, be sort of controlled, and the access is managed by them. And in particular, whatever sort of end result has to benefit Indigenous peoples as well. That seems to me that it's awfully familiar to a lot of conversations that we have currently about how we treat data that is collected by social media companies and how that is used, how that is being sold, particularly at the individual and group levels. And on that last point that I was making, that also matters too. And so we actually worked with an organization based in Toronto called Indigenous Friends Association. And what they do is that they sort of create programs that is particularly focused on early career Indigenous peoples, oftentimes youth, but not always, to not just a sort of a digital training program, but also a job placement and wraparound support after the placement at tech companies. And through working with sort of, I think, two that I think onto the third cohort now, what they have actually discovered is that oftentimes the kind of way Indigenous sort of youth and early career people think about how they want to see a role for them in the tech sector, it actually starts from how the kind of problems they see within their community and how they then want to figure out how technology can help solve those problems that exist in the communities they come from. Some of which are urban, some of which are rural. And that, I think, again, sounds awfully familiar to the thing that I said earlier, to not start with the technology, start with the kind of values, what you want to achieve as a business, as an organization. And so I think you can't actually talk about these kinds of things, how technology impacts work, workers, the economy, without actually including Indigenous peoples in the conversation, which oftentimes is just sort of if at best an afterthought and often just not part of the conversation whatsoever. So
can I add to that? I found your slides, the earlier slides, super informative in that context as well. So I know that in Ottawa, the high schools that have higher percentages of Indigenous students, a lot of them don't actually have the course offerings that would allow Indigenous students to get to the bachelor degree that you showed in your slides is actually a prerequisite for engagement in the tech sector.
Mhm.
So, you know, in addition to what you're saying there, I think there's also a huge issue around education. and access to
Absolutely.
education.
Yeah, and I don't think particularly in the context of Ontario, we can talk about that without sort of mentioning the idea of streaming, right? Well, it's not just Indigenous kids that are being streamed, it's also Black kids that are getting streamed out of the more technical courses before they can probably reasonably make decisions or even have a good judge on their ability. And so absolutely, yeah.
And your slides really brought that out, that, you know, that bachelor degree really makes a difference there. Like, so thank you for that. It's really cool.
So there's no questions in the chat. Are there any other questions around the room before I ask some more? Abraham.
I have a question. Are you aware of any policy discussions that are ongoing right now to tackle some of the challenges of this technology in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots. In Canada right now, there is a bill that is going through the committee hearing stage. Funnily enough, one of my colleagues, Sam Andrew, is going to actually testify at the industry committees tomorrow, particularly in consideration of that bill. And that bill sort of has a lot of components, particularly dealing in sort of privacy and data usage. But there is a section in that bill, what we're calling the AIDA, the Artificial Intelligence Data Act, that particularly concerns users of data in creating AI technology. And that is contextualized within a bit more of a global conversation where sort of really early yesterday, 2 days ago, the US government released, the White House released an executive order on standards on AI development. The UK government working very much on the same thing. I actually met with the team that created what's called the AI Standards Hub in the UK in Kyoto, and they were launching that sort of just about 3 weeks ago. And that, I think, conversation becomes really, really difficult because there are, I think, places for standards and how standards have worked in the past. The example I often use is thinking about how we develop new drugs. There are very stringent regimes to test for a drug's safety, for its efficacy. And the thing that makes it work is that there is a central agency, Health Canada in Canada, the Food and Drugs Administration in the States, that reviews all of that data, then sort of stamps a stamp of approval that says, hey, we approve of this. That actually therefore create a competitive advantage for companies to be following. And it is a good enough system most of the time that works outside of the political pressure that exists outside of many of the lobbying effort that allows for some fudging of these things. That's a little bit different from AI, particularly because in a pharmaceutical intervention, the outcome that you're testing for is kind of well understood. From a safety angle, that is literal physical safety. Does the person get harmed? How many dies taking the drug? 2, does it exacerbate symptoms? Does it pass the threshold of the set of side effects that makes it really difficult for people to take the drug? From the efficacy side, that's also somewhat well defined. Does it improve survival rate? Does it improve with symptom abatement? Does it actually end up addressing the disease or the illness itself? With AI technology, that's a little bit different, right? Because the same technology doesn't necessarily have a very well-defined set of objectives. Starting from a safety, because when you're talking about these kind of technology, it's not even just the individual level safety that you're talking about, it is also a societal level safety, which we don't necessarily have a good conversation how to judge, how to measure for those. In terms of efficacy, how do you measure the efficacy of an AI application that helps screen applicants for you to hire? Is it how many ends up continuing to work in the company afterwards? How do we incorporate sort of diversity aspects in that idea of efficacy? That's a whole lot more different in actually setting these sort of outcome standards for testing and evaluation than, let's say, a pharmaceutical intervention. And therefore, that makes it really difficult for any sort of central agency to be able to confidently say, independently and effectively evaluate these AI models and put the stamp of approval, because one can imagine, given the fuzziness of these things, that opens it up to a lot of lobbying efforts, a lot of political interference, and that does not create trust, and that does not create sort of competitive advantage of doing so. And so standards is one way in which people have been thinking about. Other sets of people have been thinking about if there are ways that we intentionally can change the direction of technological development, that we can be intentional from a government perspective, whether that be thinking about investing heavily in technology. In the US, I think one of the most successful example has been literally through the defense industry. DARPA, the Defense sort of Advanced Technology, where they literally have shaped a lot of the fairly important technological development we take for granted today, things like GPS, things like the internet. That was shaped very much by US defense needs that then created technology. Can we do that with AI? But what therefore is the danger of, in fact, including such considerations in AI? Who gets to decide what is good for humanity? What central body gets to decide what direction is safe, what direction is not safe? And so there are lots of conversations. I think the short answer right now is that there isn't a best way that people have figured out in approaching it. Lots of this legislation, these standards are still being tested. But hopefully that addresses some of the.
Okay. Thank you. We have a comment in the chat from, I'm sorry, it's JVDL. So thank you to JVDL. And it says that the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities is undertaking a study on the implications of artificial intelligence technologies for the Canadian labour force and the impacts that these technologies may have on different regions, organized labour, workforce sectors, and on people of diverse age groups, genders, income levels, race, and persons with disabilities. And they have very kindly included a link if you're interested in following up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to, if you don't mind sending me that.
We will ensure that you get that link. Okay, are there any other questions?
You know, the slide that you show the different race.
Yeah.
Is it people that are born in Canada or newcomers?
So the visible minority sort of definitional frame includes both people who are born in Canada and people who don't. We do look at sort of immigrants, so naturalized versus people who came here as sort of landed immigrants, which is PR. I think it's the one that's next.
You know, the
After this, that
yes.
one. Yeah. So this includes both sort of immigrants and non-immigrants who hold those visible minority identities. And so we do have, the story is actually quite similar, particularly in the idea of pay equity, regardless of whether you look at sort of immigration, whether you look at education, that Canada tends to be a whole lot more equal. But I'm happy to send you some of the numbers for the other sort of intersections after this.
It's just because I have children in high school and they will graduate soon to go to university, and I just see those kids so Canadian, even if they're so diverse. I know,
Yeah.
And I cannot see them like judged by that. I feel so saying those kids are so together, like in the same math class, in the same science class.
Yeah.
So how do you think it will be the same in 10 years?
What I'm going to say is that these numbers, so I think in the sets of previous graphs, like that's the key question that I was interested in, particularly looking at sort of structural changes, is has anything kind of shifted in the past 15 years, 2001 to 2016? The sad answer is that it hasn't shifted for the large part. And again, we're looking at 2021 numbers and we're figuring out whether 2021 is any different. Early indications that we're able to see, don't commit me to these because we haven't fully ran the numbers in the microdata yet, is that it is still not great. These numbers are from 2021, the pay numbers. And the idea here, right, is it doesn't even need to be actively discriminating. the model of discrimination that most economists use in understanding the discrimination sort of framework is actually one of sort of rational choice. Imagine if you are a Black kid, figuring out whether you want to major in a STEM degree or another degree. You look at this classmates that studies these things with you, and you realize, oh, there aren't a lot of Black kids in the class that I take. There aren't a lot of Black professors that is teaching these STEM courses. And then I look at another field of study, and the atmosphere is a whole lot more welcome. There are a lot more Black kids, there are a lot more Black professors that is teaching me these things. It is a rational decision for that Black kid to be making to take that other course instead of studying in STEM. Same thing for women. And so what matters here is not that these, I think, peoples with these identities are doing anything wrong, or they're in fact being actively sort of what we often think about the idea of discrimination, but it matters the kind of choices that they're offered and what each of those choices imply for the kind of experience that they have. And what that then comes down to is, it is not the responsibility to be solving these things is not on those people and kids with those diverse identities. It is on the actual environment that exists. And then how you think about how people that are in it have to actively and consciously create an environment that welcomes those identities in. And so oftentimes, absolutely, because you often realize that, hey, there are a lot of good people. Most people are nice. Most people treat others with respect. Most people treat each other with dignity and kindness. It doesn't actually require anyone to actively treat someone in an unkind manner, in a racist manner, in a sexist manner, for these things to end up perpetuating. It just requires the status quo to exist as a status quo, and that ends up being perpetuated.
Are there any other questions in the room?
I always have questions.
Go for it.
I have a different question, but maybe, I don't know if you've done the analyses on this one, but I wonder if you can differentiate by immigration status as well.
Yeah, no, we have done so in the 2016 census. We're actually just starting a project with the 2021 census that does the same. So, yeah.
I wonder if that would make up for some of the difference as well.
Yeah.
But I have a different question, like kind of towards the second half more of your presentation there. And the use of AI as complementary or as kind of adding to the systems that we have. And can you maybe elaborate a little bit? I have a major concern there, because I think even before AI, like if you think about call centers or those kind of scenarios, which is I think a couple of the ones that you mentioned there, you know, we have systems in place where employees have very little room for discretion, very little room for human decision making. And increasingly, I'm getting the sense that people don't even expect to have the room for decision making. So that kind of brings me to the question, you know, and imagine that will just be amplified by AI. And my question's a little bit, do you think we actually have the skills as employees, we have the skills to adequately manage the systems that are in place, like AI and complemented or not even perhaps, but do we actually have the skills in place to put checks and balances on those systems and manage these systems appropriately?
It's a really, really great question. I think I'm going to sort of address that from two different directions. So first, I'm going to sort of do the classic thing of taking a single word in your question and then sort of interpret it my own way, and then I'm actually going to answer your question. But the skills to be managing these things, I'm going to sort of talk about it from the first sense, which is my judicious interpretation, which is skills to implement these technologies at workplaces effectively or not. And I do think we just need to to remind ourselves that we can do it. And so I'll give an example. Japan and Japanese. One thing that you learn about Japan is that we are trapped by our traditions. There are every single thing that you do in the business setting has like 18 different specific sort of rituals that you follow. And that has actually oftentimes prevented Japan from adopting technologies in the fastest way, in a way that actually makes the most sense. But that, I think, has also allowed Japan, when it is adopting technology, to be a lot more thoughtful about it. And so, as an example, this actually happened post-COVID. The way that Japan has sort of adopted automatic checkout kiosks at grocery stores, it seems like such a banal example, but Japan actually has no fully automated checkout kiosks. It has a whole bunch of semi-automated checkout kiosks where there is still a human person that is still scanning every item. They transfer the items that they scan into this yellow basket without a handle. And after they scan every item that you have, they sort of send the information to one of the payment kiosks that exist. You bring the yellow basket to that kiosk and then you pay. Now, you ask, why have they done it this way? First, that face-to-face interaction is what is important in a lot of sort of Japanese business context. That hey, there's a real human person that is interacting with you. And second, that also actually allows for a lot less friction to take place when, I don't need to remember exactly what 4 numbers represent the vegetable I am checking out. I have this particular discount or point cards, that this strange request that I have that I want to be addressed that the machine doesn't know how to take care of, because there is a human person that every single customer interact with. And it cuts out the likely most straightforward and the least efficient part, the fiddling with counting monies, the tapping credit card, choosing the payment methods, and automate that out, because that does still improve the efficiency, because the person who is sort of scanning the items doesn't need to bag it, doesn't need to wait for the person to pay. They just need to send the person the payment kiosk after having solved all of those issues, and then they can actually scan the next customer. That is the kind of implementation of technology I'm talking about, where it doesn't start with, here's the technology, how can we then introduce it to the business? It's much more, here is what matters as a business, here's sort of the business problem that exists, how can technology help us solve that? And so we can do it. I do think we just need to get reminded that is in fact an option that exists, instead of, hey, this is a technology, we need to introduce it. And the second part on the skills question, on actually as an individual worker, the kind of skills you have in navigating, both in terms of to perhaps subvert it, but to use it in your advantage, that is a major issue, right? Is that I think one of the more dangerous things with the generative technologies is it is built as something that is simple to use. It is something that is simple to master. Anyone can play with it. Anyone can get the equal amount of benefit with it. That is actually not the case. In fact, it takes a particular set of skills to use, not only in terms of the technology, but you actually need a fairly specific domain knowledge to judge the quality of the responses. Otherwise, you might risk sort of putting things that are confidently wrong as a response if you don't have that domain knowledge to judge it for yourself. But a lot of that, admittedly, is still untested. And again, I sort of refer back to some of those early experiments that was ran, where it did benefit those sort of lower skilled workers a whole lot more. And as people use the technology, their understanding of what the technology can do also increased. And so that is also the thoughtful implementation of technology, right? There are some conversations, some people that says, hey, we should be replacing all teachers with a GPT-based thing. That is not a good thing, particularly because when you are learning something, the whole point is that you're kind of challenged by it. And GPT as a technology isn't sort of designed to challenge you, it is in fact designed to confidently give you an answer. But that isn't to say that we shouldn't be using GPT for everything and anything, because again, it is the fact about being thoughtful about it. And one of the most thoughtful way, it's a econ model that has existed a long time that continues to exist is learning by doing. People do learn by using a tool, because they will undoubtedly make mistakes. They will undoubtedly have silly sort of like moments using the technology. That's how you become better at it. And there is going to be friction. There's going to be, I think, friction in how, when initially that technology is implemented, on how well people can use it. But I do have some confidence in some confidence in people's skills using that to be able to learn how to use that better as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to respect the timelines that were given to us. Say thank you very much to Viet and to everyone who participated in the discussion. And particularly, I'd like to thank our two wonderful people from the ISSP, Geneviève Dunn and Jasmine Karim. We will call, I'll ask Geneviève just to do final closing statements, and she can also let you know how we can access the Zoom and all of this afterwards.
Thank you so much. So starting closing remarks by thanking Viet for your time, for traveling to chilly and frosty Ottawa today to chat with us. We really appreciate your time. And Sandra, Louise, thank you for collaborating with us and helping us put on this really fascinating discussion and really relevant. So thank you all, and thank you to the people in the room and our people online for taking time out of your day and out of your lunch hour to join us. I'm sharing in the chat a link to the ISSP link tree where you can access the ISSP website, our social channels, as well as our newsletter, so you can stay up to date on all of the ISSP content, including some exciting announcements coming from the Inclusive Innovation Research Cluster soon. So again, thank you all. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.